Hi, my name is Josiah Dupre. I'm a Cape Year 2 student at the St. Lucia Community College. I'm a national athlete who partake in many different sports, but mainly track and field, volleyball, and football. Early 2025, I earned 9 medals, achieving the school's Victor Durham for year 1. Shortly after, I qualified for the 2025 Curricular Games, despite the lack of experience and equipment needed to facilitate better training at that event. This led to me becoming the first athlete to compete for Saint Lucia in the 400-meter hurdles event. Shortly after, I won high jump for the Intersecondary School Island Champs and many other track and field meets, earning the title as Saint Lucia's #1 high jumper. This then led to me qualifying for the Windward Island Games in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, competing in a high jump, multiple field events, and the 4x400 meter relay. At the Windwards, I also made my first appearance for a national volleyball team. Later 2025, I then dedicated myself to become one of the best middle blockers, earning my spot to represent Saint Lucia at the Under-23 ECVA men's volleyball competition in Antigua and Barbuda, where I contributed to the team immensely, both mentally and physically. Excellence to me is the process of achieving success and striving no matter the obstacle faced or situation that you are in.
Good morning, I am Ziana Boulogne-Joseph. I currently serve as the Director of the School of Lifelong Learning and Professional Practice at the St. Lucia Community College. I previously served as Lecturer and Head of Department in the Faculty of Agriculture and Tourism. I recently completed my Doctorate of Education, where my research focused on the adoption of competency-based approaches in TVET systems within the Caribbean. To me, excellence is not about being perfect or having everything together. It's about being consistent, having a commitment to continuous improvement. I strive for excellence because I believe we are here to serve a greater purpose. We are given opportunities and abilities, not just for personal achievement and advancement, but to serve others. So for me, excellence means executing that responsibility with integrity and to the best of our abilities. So my advice is simple: be consistent, be faithful in what you are doing, even when it is difficult. Take the small steps, because small steps over time result in great impact. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tracy Pilgrim George, Chairperson for Sir Arthur Lewis Community College's activities within the Nobel Laureate Festival 2026. The festival is now in full swing under the theme Celebrating Excellence, Honoring Our Legacy, Shaping Our Tomorrow. SALCC is proud to lead 4 signature activities this year. First, the Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture on Thursday, 22nd January, featuring world-renowned economist Professor Sir Tim Besley, speaking on economic principles for the 21st century. On Friday, 23rd January, we host the Nobel Laureate's wreath-laying ceremony with reflections by cultural, scholar, and theatre practitioner Dr. Anthea Octal. Then on Wednesday, 28th January, Writers in the Spotlight celebrate St. Lucian authors, including emerging young writers, giving them a national platform. As we close with the Farmers Market on Saturday, 31st January, highlighting women in agriculture, sustainability, and entrepreneurship. This festival reminds us that legacy is not only honored, it is built. We invite all St. Lucians to come out, participate, and be inspired. Hi, I'm
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are about to begin, and at this time, we ask you to ensure that all your devices are on silent or vibrate so that we have a seamless lecture this evening. We are streaming live, And of course, our cameras may be positioned on you at any time, so we remind you of all of the protocols and etiquette of being on television. And as we begin, let me invite Ms. Saruna Tuse, a student of the South Louis Community College, to position herself at the podium for the national anthem, followed by press by Mr. Ethan Alexander, student representative of the Students' Council, who we also ask to position himself near the podium.
Good night, thank you.
Hold on. Please stand for the national anthem of Saint Lucia.
Sons and daughters of Saint Lucia, love the land that gave us birth, land of beaches, hills and valleys, fairest of all the earth. Wheresoever you may roam, love, oh love, our island home. Gone the times when nations battled for this land of the West. Gone the days when strife and discord dimmed her children's toil and rest. Dawns at last a brighter day, stretches out a glad new way. May the good Lord bless our island, guard her sons from war and harm. May our people live united, strong in soul and strong in arm. Justice, truth, and charity, our ideal forever be.
Please remain standing for prayers.
Catholics, please stand yourself. Dear Father God, I ask that you guide us during the presentation, Father. I ask that you open our minds so that we can take in all information, Father. Dear God, I ask you to, guide us, Father, as we celebrate our 2 Nobel Laureates, Father. Guide us, Father, so we can understand the wisdom that the speaker has brought here for us. I ask that you guide us, Father, guide all the students of Saint Lucia, Father. Guide us, Father. I ask you to guide us that after this wonderful presentation, that we reach our house safely, Father. And I pray, amen.
Amen. Please be seated.
Raisa Joseph is a lecturer at the South Louis Community College, where she provides instruction in various historical contexts, including St. Lucian, Caribbean, colonial, and European histories. Her professional career spans political analysis, communications, leadership in community and civic development, and socio-cultural research. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Political Science with International Relations and a Master of Philosophy in Political Science. Her national service includes representation on the St. Lucian National Reparations Committee, the GEF Small Grants Program National Steering Committee of St. Lucia, and the Cultural Development Foundation's National Emancipation Committee.
Her Excellency, Dame Paulette Louisi, Governor General Emerita and Chairperson of the Nobel Laureate Festival, Sir Tim Besley, William Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics, London School of Economics, and our esteemed lecturer, Honorable Wayne Girard, Minister for Economic Development and the Youth Economy, His Excellency Dr. Didicus Jules, Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, His Excellency Julian Dubois, Ambassador for Diaspora Affairs, Miss Amy Quantrill, Resident British Commissioner, British High Commission, Becky Davies, Economic Advisor, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, Mr. Cletus Springer, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College and members of the Board of Governors, Principal of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, Dr. Marjorie Jameson Charles, former managers and staff of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, other specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, in audience presently and virtually, good evening. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Makata, no bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Yes, while we know we are at a lecture, we know we are in Saint Lucia where it is customary to greet warmly. I am Raisa Joseph, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture. Oswea nous kay célébrer pep nous et puis chime excellence cette ici. And it is fitting that our theme is celebrating excellence, honoring our legacy, shaping our tomorrow. Aso chime sala côté nous ka célébrer pep nous. Par exemple, Derek Walcott et puis Arthur Lewis, nous ka garder qui manière nous sa bâti un pays qui pli fort. Expressement di wote difficile ça là. Et puis activité au souhait qui fait nous changer importance l'histoire nous, éducation et puis un pays qui a réfléchi à son développement tout. So we must reflect, we must discuss, we must engage in looking at how not just our economy but society can move forward, and we have an esteemed lecturer who will guide us during today's proceedings, and I'm hoping that you too will engage him as he enlightens us and shares with us his own insights. But to welcome you formally, please put your hands together for the Chairman of the Board of Governors, Mr. Cletus Springer, who will address us at this time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Joseph, or if I might call you Raisa. I feel a lot more comfortable doing that. Good evening, everybody. You didn't come here to hear me, so I have good reason to be brief. But before I get too deep into my brief remarks, I would like to acknowledge the absence of someone who maintained a steady presence at these lectures. Dr. Gregor Williams passed away a few weeks ago. And traditionally, at moments like these, we tend to offer a minute's silence. But on this occasion, I want to ask you to join me in applauding Dr. Williams's selfless, incisive, and stellar contribution to our country's sustainable development. Deirdre is here, Dr. Williams' wife is here, and it's good to see you here. I was so happy when I looked in the room and saw you. Thank you for coming. She told me that she felt Sir Arthur might need her presence here tonight, but as you can tell from the tune out, other people thought like you. So, using the established protocols, I welcome you to this memorial lecture in commemoration of Sir William Arthur Lewis's contribution to development economics. You know as well as I do that he was one of the most influential economists of the 20th century and undoubtedly one of the Caribbean's most distinguished intellectual sons. But tonight we gather not only to remember a remarkable scholar, but also to reflect on the enduring his ideas and the values that guided his life's work. It is universally accepted that Sir Arthur transformed the study and practice of development economics. Through his pioneering work on economic growth, structural transformation, and labor markets, he reshaped how the world understands development in poorer nations. And you know, as I know, that in 1979, he achieved a milestone of global significance when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, making him the first Nobel laureate in that field to do so. Our presence here today reflects our appreciation of the fact that Sir Arthur's legacy extends far beyond academic achievement. He believed deeply that economics must serve society and that rigorous scholarship should be matched with moral purpose. As an advisor to governments, as an educator, and as a public intellectual, he worked tirelessly to ensure that economic progress translated into human dignity and opportunity for all of the world's poor. In a sense, he was of the conviction that there can be no economic progress if it does not impact positively the lives of the poor. This memorial lecture stands as testament to Sir Arthur's enduring influence and his legacy. It's an invitation to us to continue the critical conversations, as Raisa said, that he has begun. And the state of the geopolitics in our world gives us ample reason, if we ever needed one, for us to reflect on how we might pivot in the face of these challenges that we now confront. So it's my hope, Sir Tim, well, it's my conviction, I should say as well, that your lecture will give us some very inspiring benchmarks that would allow us to think boldly and act responsibly, as well as remain committed to inclusive and sustainable development. On behalf of the Board of Governors, on behalf of the Sir Arthur Lewis Nobel Laureate Committee, I welcome you, Sir Tim, and I ask us all to receive your lecture warmly. Thank you.
Thank you immensely, Chair. We also wish to recognize in our presence Monsignor Patrick Anthony, the founder of the Folk Research Center in Saint Lucia, last year's keynote speaker, Dr. Clarence Henry, and other members of the Nobel Laureate Committee. At this time, we wish to welcome to deliver brief remarks Amy Quantrill, the resident British High Commissioner in Saint Lucia, who is also responsible for our esteemed lecturer this evening. Please put your hands together for her.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Let me adopt the protocol that has already been established. I'm delighted to be here and get the opportunity to talk to you ahead of the main event, Sir Besley's lecture on economic principles for the 21st century. Sir Arthur Lewis's life provides an excellent example of the deep links between the UK and St. Lucia, and that benefit both our countries and the people that live in them. I think most of us in the audience are well aware of Sir Arthur's legacy, both here in St. Lucia, and the impact he had on global economic thought. But I wanted to take this opportunity to specifically speak about his impact in the UK. In his late teens, Sir Arthur won a scholarship and went to study at the London School of Economics, where he obtained a first-class degree and a further scholarship for a PhD, which he also completed there. He was then appointed as a temporary assistant lecturer in 1938. He remained teaching with LSE and also worked for the Colonial Office, which helped to inform his views on development economics. The building housing the Department of Economics at LSE today is now named in his honour. In 1948, at the young age of 33, he was appointed to the chair at Manchester University, and in doing so, he became Britain's first black professor. While at Manchester, he developed some of his most important concepts about the patterns of capital and wages in developing countries, including the Lewis model, which the professor will talk more about later this evening. In addition to his contribution to development economics at the university, while at Manchester, Sir Arthur also made notable contributions to the wider community, really putting his moral beliefs into practice. He recognised how essential education is to economic development and set up 2 innovative social and education centres in the south of the city, which was home to large Afro-Caribbean populations. One of these still serves the community today as the West Indies Sports and Social Centre. In addition to Sir Arthur's outsized contribution to the UK's record of academic excellence, he also fought for and achieved more inclusive and less prejudiced academic institutions, which in turn have benefited the UK's education system and society as a whole. His contributions to the communities where he lived and worked continue to have impact today. Sir Arthur also symbolises the shared passions for economic analysis and job-rich, inclusive economic growth that both Saint Lucia and the United Kingdom are pursuing. As a resident British Commissioner, I see this as a prime example for further cooperation. And indeed, this week we are proud to be co-funding the Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Facility to partner with the St. Lucian Tax Administration to strengthen their reform management. We also hope to increase trade ties between our nations to diversify and strengthen our economies in partnership. So let me end with a request for this audience to continue to collaborate and partner with the UK across trade, culture, tourism, security, climate, foreign policy, the many human and institutional ties that link us closely together and benefit us both. On the academic front, there are many scholarships open to St. Lucians, both through the UK government, such as the Chevening programme, and directly with academic institutions. Finally, I'd like to thank the Nobel Laureate Organising Committee for making this lecture possible, and to Sir Besley for joining us here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for contextualizing that Sir William Arthur Lewis has done more than simply win a Nobel Prize, but contribute to meaningful development within and outside of Saint Lucia. Between 1901 and 2025, not counting those that have been gifted, the Nobel Prize has been awarded about 663 times to 990 individuals. And I think we take for granted that in the Caribbean, particularly the English-speaking Caribbean, it has been awarded 3 times, twice to St. Lucians. And that is an extraordinary feat that we must applaud as St. Lucians and remind ourselves, as we have seen in our videos of excellence, that there is excellence among us by no small feat. As with all things that are St. Lucian and Caribbean by nature, we welcome the multi-talented Mrs. Elra Erme Glasgow, who will sing for us, You Can Be Next, part of the theme song for the Nobel Laureate Festival. Put your hands together for her.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. You ready to celebrate excellence? Yes. All right. Let me practice my steps. Let's celebrate excellence. Yeah. Oh yes, we come from smallness, yet still we achieve greatness. Just look at Sir Arthur Lewis. Just look at Sir Derek Walcott. Oh yes, they set the example and showed us it is possible for us St. Lucians work to be deserving of the highest recognition. Tum ta-dum ta-da-dum, tum ta-da-dum, ta-da-dum, tum. Sir Arthur Lewis made us proud. A pioneer was he, developing our small economy. Gave us the cure for poverty. No, it's not money. It's knowledge that will elevate this country. Oh yes, we come from smallness, yet still we achieve greatness. Just look at Sir Arthur Lewis. Just look
and Sir Derek Walcott. Oh yes, they set the example and showed us it is possible for us St. Lucians work to be deserving of the highest recognition. Let me go on the other side. I have something to tell them about Sir Derek. It was in the field of literature Sir Derek Walcott made his mark. He's a great creator, lover of the arts. Our rich history and our folklore, our people and our culture inspire the works of this accomplished author. Oh yes, let me hear you. Yet still, just look, oh yes, and show for us St. Lucians work to be deserving of the highest recognition. Tam ta da tam. You can be next, even though you're from a little isle. Even though you're now just a child, you can be next. Strive for excellence in all you do. Yeah, next Nobel Laureate could be you. You can be next. You can be next, even though you're now just a child. You can be next, strive for excellence in all you do. Yeah, it could be you. Tam ta dum ta da da dum. Tam ta dum ta da dum. You can be next. You can be next. Thank you.
I think she deserves another round of applause. Ishati a comme si di, ifouet mon receiver dite kako e ki tellement bon, you want to get it again? That was the phenomenal Mrs. Elra Erme Glasgow, who is also an economics lecturer at the Seraphine Community College. So, round of applause for her. So, though we are small, we are dynamic, we have many skills and talents which we use for Saint Lucia. And so, we've now come to the part of our program where we introduce our keynote speaker via video presentation, where he will later develop his lecture on economic principles for the 21st century. Pointe si passos affaires économiques pour nous.
Satin Besley is a professor of economics, political science, and Sir Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics at the London School of Economics. Before joining LSE, he taught at Princeton. He is a graduate of Oxford University, where he was a Fellow of All Souls College. He is also a recipient of the Uri Johnson Prize and the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award in Economics, Finance, and Management, as well as a past president of the Econometric Society and the Royal Economic Society. He has served as an advisor to the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and has served as a member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. His main research interests concern how to make economic policies work more effectively.
Well, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, this has been one of the most remarkable introductions to a lecture I've ever experienced. And you really know how to do it in Saint Lucia. That's all I can say. Thank you so much. And for all the hospitality you've shown me and my wife while we've been on a short holiday here before the lecture. So a real privilege to be here. And as you may have gathered from the introduction, that my life intersected only a little with Sir Arthur Lewis, in the sense that I'm now at the LSE, of course, where he studied and received his first lecturing job. But also then my first job was at Princeton, where he moved to ultimately. And that was on one occasion I actually got to meet him towards the end of his life. So it was a wonderful experience for me, because when I first studied development economics, one of the first articles I was assigned to read was his classic Nobel Prize-winning essay, which created a whole paradigm, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that during my lecture, and a real approach, and has been a lasting contribution. Here's the test, that if any student came to me today and said they wanted to study development economics, I would still suggest they read that essay more around 70 years old. There are almost no things I think in economics now that last or stand the test of time like that work. So it's a true honor for me to be here today and to have the opportunity to share with you my take on his legacy, and then to talk about shaping our tomorrow, so trying to fit both of the themes of this week. And of course, when we talk about Arthur Lewis, we're automatically celebrating excellence, so that's almost taken for granted in this. I probably should have put this slide up just now when I was talking about Sir Arthur Lewis. I like this photograph. It conveys for me a sense of fun and a sense of enjoyment, but in what he was doing. So I like this whenever I introduce him or talk about his work. But I think it shows the stature of a person if we don't just talk about their work, but we talk about the paradigm in which they worked. That they created a paradigm, a way of thinking that really transformed the way we study a subject. And I think what was central, a lot of people had talked before him about economic growth. That was not a new topic, that had a long history. But I think it's fair to say that distinguishing between just growth and development was not well established at the time when he wrote his famous essay. And what he emphasized, and I think this is where I'm going to pick up on this, talking about some of the future ideas, is on the idea of structural change, real transformation. And for him, that was, in the essay I mentioned, that was about the transformation of an agricultural economy into an economy based more on manufacturing and services. That was his conception of structural transformation. But the idea that when we look at economies, it's not just about the economies expanding, but about the people moving into new and different activities and the processes that create that really underpins a process of economic change and growth. And he really understood that. Now, he also understood the role of government, and that's going to bring me to some more controversies later in my discussion of where we are. But he understood that you could not have meaningful economic development without a role for government. And you could think of that as in two parts. Government dealing with the kinds of frictions and of that transformation process. It's not an automatic process. There are things, always barriers in the way of making that process work, and he understood that. And one role of government is to try and reduce those frictions, the things that are preventing structural change happening. So the way I like to think about this, there's really two key roles for government in economic development. One is the supporting role of government, ensuring that the market and private businesses can operate effectively, but also going beyond what the market can do, what you might call a market augmenting role. And I think he understood both the supporting role and the augmenting role. Now, that paradigm remains pretty powerful today. And actually, I have a young student who's on the academic job market, who actually links his work. He's a Chinese student, and this picture here is from his paper, in the Lewis paradigm. Because what he points out, if you look at Chinese economic development, one of the big stories has been exactly the story that Arthur Lewis told, that there was a transformation, people have moved out of agriculture into other sectors of the economy. And he draws this picture, you won't see it very clearly here, of all of the labor flows across different parts of China that have been essential to the transformation of the Chinese economy, and the role of what labor agencies in facilitating people moving across regions to economic opportunity. And of course, in a vast country like China, quite different from Saint Lucia in that respect, that's having people move great distances has been central to the whole transformation process. So that's a paper that's just been written, and it's still being written to reflect the ideas in Arthur Lewis's work. And normally we say, well, this is a paradigm or an approach that's most relevant to what might be called the emerging world or the developing world. But actually I take issue with that, because any economy, however advanced or whatever stage of development, is experiencing structural change. People are moving to different and new occupations all the time. So the idea of people transforming their economic activities is just there and present wherever you look at it. And an example I'll come back to in a minute is going to be the impact of artificial intelligence on the kinds of jobs people do and the kind of work that they do. And that's going to be a process of structural transformation. We're all talking about that and what impact that's going to have. And I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. But now I'll come to the slightly more controversial side. Exactly what is the role of government in all of this process? I think on that, there's been relatively less agreement. I mean, you can believe that this is the right way to conceptualize what economic change is about without necessarily knowing how it is the government can support that. And of course, there are many debates about how hands-on should the state be. I mean, what is that role? Has the state got sufficient competence to fulfill that role? And in what ways does politics matter? And I'm going to talk about all of those as I proceed. But I'll start with a sort of brief history of where Lewis's thinking, I think, fits into the post-war economic paradigms that have been out there, particularly vis-a-vis the role of the state. I'll specifically talk about that. And one could say that the post-Second World War economies, at least in the more democratic part of the world, or at least those that subscribe predominantly to a market system, accepted that there should be a fairly heavy reliance on the state. And we often talk now about the post-war consensus. And that was very much supported by global institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, regional development banks, accepted that the process of development required a strong state and a state that was competent. And that was true even though, if you recall, in that period, the world globally, there was a schism between capitalism and socialism, liberal democracy and one-party states. But within the largely capitalist democratic world, there was a feeling that a lot of the support for development had to come from the state. And I think that is where Lewis's ideas landed, his original work landed, because it was very clear you could insert his understanding of economic development into a state-led paradigm and see the role of the state as very central to that process of structural transformation that I described. But one thing that I think was quite particular about Lewis's work in his paradigm was his analysis based on what I would call political economy. The idea that you can't take for granted that the state is going to do the things you want the state to do. that has to be studied as a subject. How can you make states, or how can you guarantee that states work well? So there's this lovely quote from his theory of economic growth that says government can be as damaging to confidence as bandits or rioters. That's the sort of negative take on that. But he also understood the positive role of government. The government can promote growth. And he talks about promoting opportunities that provide for specialization, etc. And these debates live on in political economy today, and I'm going to come back to that a little later in my lecture. Now, the 1970s began to see a real shift in the mainstream debate that was going on. There was something of a crisis of particularly what we might call the advanced capitalist economies. They became much more unstable. There were the oil price shocks. Some of you in the room will remember that era. A lot of macroeconomic instability, countries getting into debt and having to struggle with debt. And that led to, perhaps not surprisingly, some amount of shift in the mainstream thinking. And it led, I would argue, to quite a big shift in policy making, and I'm going to talk about that. And I think, to be fair, those things that I described were a huge test of state competence. Some states managed the shock, like the energy price shocks of the 1970s well. Many didn't. And their citizens were pretty dissatisfied. And of course, that provoked a debate and discussion about whether there needed to be a different model, a less state-driven model. And by the end of the 1970s, at least in some places in the world, the dial had shifted considerably. And I'll date this from the late 1970s, when in Britain, Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979. In America, Ronald Reagan was elected. And there was a real shift in the rhetoric of economics, the kind of economics that people were listening to, and eventually, as I'll explain in a moment, this spilled over to economic thinking more generally. So here's an example of the world according to Ronald Reagan. I'm not going to read out the whole quote, but you'll not be surprised to hear that it expresses a much more skeptical role of government than had perhaps been alive in a previous era. And this comes from his first State of the Union address, where he said, "I asked a group of economists to tell me what was wrong with the American economy, and I regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression." And he goes on to say it's the heavy hand of government, basically. Government has gone too far, and government is now part of the problem. It's not the solution, it's the problem. And the dial really began to shift. One of the people who was regularly appearing on American TV at that time was someone called Milton Friedman, another Nobel Laureate, of course, but not in the same spirit as Arthur Lewis. But he said, at last, we need a crisis. We needed a crisis to tell us that we'll get real change. And when that crisis occurs, I've got all the answers. So just come to me, I'm going to describe it. And of course, Milton Friedman's answers were all about, again, the retreat of the state. And this led to a different kind of emergent consensus, which was sometimes called neoliberal thinking that the market had a much bigger role to play and states had a much smaller role to play. And if only we could unleash the market, all would be good or better. And from that came something that many of you will be familiar with, something called the Washington Consensus. Now, there's many misconceptions about what the Washington Consensus was and why it came about. But the story is, in fact, that it was really directed at a very specific part of the world. It was not considered a general recipe book for economic development. It was a meeting in Washington, D.C., that's why it was called at the time the Washington Consensus, of mainly Latin American finance ministers who were grappling with indebtedness in their economies in the 1980s. And John Williamson, a British economist actually, said, I think I know what these people are talking about and what they're saying. It wasn't he was endorsing it. It very often came to believe that people came to believe he was endorsing it, but I don't think that's correct. He said, I'm going to write down what I think these people want, And this is a new consensus. And why was it an important consensus? Because, of course, based in Washington, D.C., were organizations like the World Bank and the IMF that have the capacity to propagate ideas around the world. So this potentially became a playbook, not just for Thatcher's Britain or Reagan's US. It became something that was much more internationalized. And the main ideas, some people said they were deeply controversial. Other people said, isn't it obvious this is what we want to do? So it became controversial among some. But it was called a consensus. It was called the Washington Consensus. And what were the main ideas? Basically the 10 commandments, as they were sometimes called. Fiscal policy discipline, redirection of public spending away from subsidies, tax reform, interest rates determined by markets, competitive exchange rates, trade liberalization, liberalization of inward investment, privatization of state enterprises, deregulation, and legal security for property rights. Now, you may say some of these are fine, others you may take an issue with, but it kind of became the playbook that a lot of people said was driving policy, particularly then in the 80s and certainly into the 1990s. And I think it's fair to say, many say that these ideas are still sitting out there and just going to get redeployed time and time again. And others think we've got beyond them. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. I think what this illustrates, and something I've come to believe quite strongly, and I love this little quote here from Keynes, is these ideas we learn in the classroom in some cases, we might learn more practically in other cases, do become ingrained in policy making, and their intellectual influence often comes from academics. Of course, this was written before Milton Friedman, but Keynes said, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. And I think this did influence the world. If you think we entered in the 1990s into what will, I think when the history books are written, is going to be thought of as the era of globalization, was largely driven by a shift in thinking about the way to run economies. So it was immensely powerful. And I'm sure there'll be people here in Saint Lucia who can spot the consequences of some of these ideas in Saint Lucian economic policy. I don't think there was any country in the world that was totally immune from things that happened under that heading. Now, some would say there were benefits, and I think they'd be right to say there were benefits from this. Some gains from openness of markets and global trade. It's hard to dispute for many countries that this was enormously beneficial. And certainly allowed workers from emerging market economies, therefore, to get into more productive jobs in many cases. But it was built on a belief that although there were losers in the system, and everyone always accepted it wasn't gains for everybody, the benefits would sort of trickle down from the beneficiaries to the losers. So ultimately, we would all be better off if we only pursued this model. And I think it's fair to say, and it's a slightly longer argument, but I won't go into it in detail, that many of the new technologies that we now enjoy were made possible because the extent of the market expanded under this era of globalization. It meant that new technologies and new ideas now could be sold to the world, not just within any given economy. So technology diffusion and opportunity went with it. Now, isn't it fair to say that there was always disquiet about this shift? There were many people arguing against some of the changes that came with the policy shift I've described. And they will they're very culturally, and economically specific to each country. Each country will recognize more or less some of these things. Certainly some skepticism about trickle-down benefits. Was it really the case that the losers were ultimately benefiting from these changes, or were they permanent losers? I mean, an example in my own country was the closure of the coal mines. You could make a very persuasive case that closing down coal mining when you could buy cheap coal from Poland or somewhere else made economic sense. But the communities that they left behind, which were scarred and remain scarred to this day. Now, it doesn't mean that there shouldn't have been the closure of the coal mines, but it just means that government policy was really not thinking well enough about what happens when a community gets hit like that. There's, of course, increasing recognition of some of the environmental consequences of the changes in policy. Now, you know, in some cases, they were really exacerbated by this. There was concern that although this globalization, the era of globalization and increased economic specialization, it made countries much more vulnerable to shocks. So think of the global financial crisis and its consequences. It was spread across the world, or COVID even. I mean, one could say in a much more closed world, maybe COVID would not have turned into a global pandemic quite the speed it did. Concerns about security, economic security, as well as international security, conventional security concerns, but I'm thinking particularly global supply chains. And we are all heavily dependent on Taiwan's production of high-end chips. And essentially, there's been some diversification away from production in a small number of countries, but if for some reason that was disrupted, the whole global tech industry would be disrupted as a consequence. And so many people have been saying, well, it's time for a rethink, but what is the rethink? What is the idea? So we at the LSE, what do academics do when they want to rethink? They have a conference. At least they start with a conference. Hopefully it goes beyond that. So in 2023, with my colleague Andres Velasco, who's a former finance minister of Chile, we decided to pull together a group of economists to rethink what would be a new consensus. And what would it consist of? And you won't, unfortunately, it's a little too small to read, but I'll say two things. One is, this book is available open access right after this lecture, should you wish. You can go on our website, at the LSE Press website, and download any amount of it you would like to read. So that was one thing we said. We don't want ideas that don't travel, and one way to make them travel is everything is open access. But we brought together a pretty interesting group of economists, mostly with some prior association with the LSE, but not exclusively so. I'd like to think for sure, if it had been in his era, that Arthur Lewis would have been invited to this, and I don't know what he'd have made of it. And rather grandiosely, there was some debate about this, as you imagine, we decided to call it a London consensus. And people disputed in two ways, by the way. Why do you want a consensus? I'll come back to that. And why London? Well, the only reason it was London, because that's where we held the conference. We're not proclaiming that infinite knowledge travels around the world from London. It was just the location of the conference, I promise you, that led us to call that. But the interesting thing is, the more that people told us calling it a consensus and calling it the London consensus was going to prove controversial, the more attractive the idea felt, because we thought, well, we want people to read this. We want them to critique it if they don't like it. And the first thing you have to do to make something people read it at all is that they think they might want to take issue with it. No one reads things to agree with them. They generally otherwise just ignore it completely, and that was definitely not our intention. So we gathered this excellent group together, and we asked each of them, what would be a consensus view that you think could be supported in your area of expertise? So we have people who worked on trade, on gender, on political economy, on labor markets, all different areas, and we asked them to come up with what they would say are the consensus principles that we should bring in. And then instead, we thought that one of the mistakes of the Washington consensus was to think about it all as consensus on policy. And I'm going to, the last bit of my lecture will really be to unpack that idea. Because policies have to be contextual. No, you can't just rock up in any country in the world and take out your manual and say, here are my policies, before you've even barely got off the plane. And so we decided very early on that's not what we were about. What we were about was trying to think of a set of principles that could guide policy, but not the policies themselves would be evolved from those principles rather than the policies coming before the principles. And that's because culture, historical context is so important for policy making. And the other thing to say is we view our consensus as a political economy consensus, and you'll see why that's the case in a moment. But as I said, many people doubted the value of a consensus, and here's someone who I'm sure would have not enjoyed what we did for many reasons, but and she says the following, this is a quote from Margaret Thatcher's memoir, The Downing Street Years: "What great cause would have been fought and won under the banner, 'I stand for consensus'?" So surely what you want is to create debate, because from debate, I think we're pretty good as humans. Once we get into a debate and a discussion, we get somewhere. And if we all begin in the same place, we're not going to have a very interesting discussion. So we kind of buy that. But we think there is scope for consensus on ideas, at least a set of ideas that will help guide, not necessarily a consensus on a set of policies, as I said. And we think the best work is also, you can support principles from evidence. So we asked all of the people who wrote for us, give us the evidence behind your consensus ideas. And we think and maybe this is, don't know how far this resonates with you, but for me, I think one of the things you have to do if you're going to build policy is to find grounds for common interest, the areas where people can get together and really rally around an idea. And I know we have the minister here this evening, who I hope that resonates with you, your approach to governing too. But I think we make a big difference when we can get together and agree on where our common interests lie, and ultimately then how we can create the kind of functional and capable state to deliver those ideas. And that's kind of where we come down. So what are our principles? I'm going to go through this quite quickly, but just to give you a flavor and to hopefully it sort of give you an idea of what we think are the things that could be guiding and are very different, I think, from the ideas in the Washington Consensus, and you can take me to task on that should you wish in the Q&A that we have. The first is perhaps so obvious to not be worth saying, but I think among economists it is worth repeating, that you cannot always evaluate something just according to the financial gains and losses, and I'll come to that in a minute. Growth still matters, but so does place. It's important to build resilience. I'm going to go through this more slowly, so you don't have to memorize it now. There's no good economics without good politics, and a capable state is the complement for everything. So I'll briefly explore and unpack each of these ideas for you. So it's not just about the money, it's well-being that matters. And economists, I think, are driving force behind some of the ideas that we're underpinning the Washington Consensus, and certainly the economics of globalization, is you can just make the pie or make the economy as big as possible, and you can deal with any of the fallout from that by kind of compensating the losers. I think we've learned that's not a good way to run an economy. You cannot just ride roughshod over losers and promise them that they'll be fine tomorrow. That what you produce, how you produce it, and where you produce it really matters. It's not just a case of those things are sort of, they can happen anywhere and in any way. And that's because what people value very often in their lives, and say perhaps to non-economists this is so blindingly obvious that it's not worth saying, the ideas of community and dignity and self-respect. But you won't find those ideas in many economics textbooks. It's about who got what, how much money did they get. So think of a job. A job is described by many economists as a wage and a number of hours of work. A job is so much more than that. A job is a source of dignity and community, and so when we're thinking about the kind of economy you want to create, those ideas have to be there. And so I think it's particularly important when dealing with issues around technology and trade and the impact of those. I think it goes beyond, and so some of you may be familiar with this, that now there's a lot of interest in what's called happiness economics. So let's forget GDP, let's look at happiness instead. And there are ways of measuring happiness. People will gripe about the exact right way to measure happiness, but they're mainly through subjective well-being questions. So you might be asked, rate how well is your life going? It's called the Cantrell ladder of life question. And you can rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. And then you can look at what that's correlated with. And actually what comes out is pretty sensible when you ask people what makes them happy. I mean, it does turn out that it is correlated with economic circumstances. You'd be shocked if it wasn't. So on the left panel here, you won't see it very clearly, there's a list of countries. Unfortunately, Saint Lucia wasn't covered in the data set I had, so I imagine you're so happy, aren't you? Yeah, maybe you're so happy they didn't put you in the data. Anyway, but you do get an upward sloping line between economic development and measured by GDP and happiness. But people who study this recognize that happiness is a lot more than just having more resources and more stuff. And in fact, there's a movement. And you could join tomorrow. You can go to the website and join it. It was created by the Dalai Lama together with an economics professor at the LSE, who still, by the way, comes to his office at the age of 92. So he's fully committed. And it's called Action for Happiness. And some people said there's 3 steps to heaven. There's 12 steps to happiness, it turns out. And if you go on their website, it's called Action for Happiness. They have giving, relating, exercising, awareness, trying out. They have the principles that they think are the principles towards living a happier life. And many of those things can be encouraged and thought about in economic terms. Okay, second principle. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I shall speed up if needed. Am I doing all right? Okay, fine. I think I'm going to be good. Growth still matters. Now, that, again, some would say is very controversial, some not. There's a sort of degrowth movement now, and I'll address that head on in a couple of slides' time. Of course, we are entering a world where growth is expected to slow down around the world. If you look at the World Bank's latest projections, we are entering a period where growth will be considerably lower. So why does it matter that we might be entering a period of low growth? Well, first of all, countries that are growing don't just pay lower wages and other such things. There are issues around funding social programs that opportunities are created by growth. Distributional consequences and the green transition become more difficult if we think such a transition is needed. And there are many things that growth can bring, in principle, if the government can harness the benefits of growth. Growth is important to poverty reduction, creating more public provision, and creating the resources we need for investment. But of course, we don't just want growth, we want inclusive and sustainable growth. Now, in the Washington Consensus view, more or less the view was, you get the prices right, growth will happen. It's just kind of some automatic byproduct of getting the prices right, whatever that means. But actually, we've learned a lot. And in fact, I have a colleague, Philippe Aghion, who just won the Nobel Prize this year for his work on growth. And that work is really about how you create an ecosystem for growth. And that means creating a system for innovation, adoption, and adaptation of ideas. And we understand that much, much better now. We also understand the role of what we call economic rents, meaning people who benefit privately from growth is needed to motivate people to innovate and grow. But if you let those rents become too large, what do they want to do? They want to stop other firms entering their markets. So often that turns into a barrier to growth. That's something we've seen through history. And it's one of the big challenges with the large tech companies in the world now is they want to remain the large tech companies and they don't want entrants coming and challenging their position. So there's always a challenge in how you manage the growth process. I think growth can also make doing politics easier because in a growing economy, there's stuff to distribute, there's gains to distribute. And actually there is evidence from survey data that zero-sum thinking that your gain is my loss, is propagated in low-growth environments. People are much more likely to have a zero-sum view of the world, perhaps quite rightly. If you're in a stagnant economy, if someone gets more, someone else must get less. But the prospect of a growing economy is that there's opportunities for everyone to gain. And in fact, in some other recent work that I've done, you tend to find that people who've experienced long periods of slow growth trust their government much less. There's a kind of feedback effect, and that's because they start to blame government for low growth. So Japan is a very interesting case. If you look at the cohorts in Japan that experienced the big long period of expansion versus the more recently born cohorts who haven't experienced much growth, you have much lower levels of trust in government among the younger cohorts in Japan compared to those who lived through the period of growth. So there may be various political consequences. But of course, why is growth skepticism? Why are some people doubting the value of growth? It's the impact on the environment. And my colleague at LSE, Nick Stern, again, this is a free download. Anyone can download his book on the growth story of the 21st century. He actually argues that growth is perfectly compatible with a green transition. There's no trade-off. A lot of people say, well, we can either have growth or we can have a world with a better environment and nature. Nick argues, I think somewhat persuasively, that the two are compatible. They have to be managed in the right way, and it comes back to what the role for government is. That the government's needed to manage that balance between nature and economic growth. Third principle, building resilience. As I said to you before, the Washington Consensus was born out of a period of economic instability, particularly macroeconomic instability. And so we don't back off the idea that countries that don't have sound monetary and fiscal policies are probably not going to be able to deliver for their citizens, because there's a backdrop to having effective government programs. You need some amount of stability. But I think it's fair to say that resilience means a lot more than that. It means having a government that can deal with particularly uninsurable shocks. The traditional one, of course, we always think about is losing your job. It's very hard to insure against losing a job, but the government can provide social protection against losing a job and other forms of instability that we've all experienced in the form of COVID, so more attention to things like resilience around health issues. Now, of course, those ideas are not new. William Beveridge, who we view in the UK, at least the father of the welfare state, also an LSE person. I'm getting a little LSE heavy in this talk, but I think with some it's certainly warranted, I think. Talked about the five giants. This is a cartoon, came out in one of the newspapers at the time. Idleness, want, disease, ignorance, and squalor. I still think that list sort of resonates as the kinds of things that we build capable and effective states to try and avoid. So we think resilience should remain very much, and again, not mentioned, not one word about resilience really, except the macroeconomic stability in the Washington Consensus. Now on to there's no good economics without good politics. Now economists have often been very snooty about politics. They think if politicians would get out the way and allow the economists to run the world, everything would be great. I happen not to agree with that. And I'm not just saying that because the minister. I think we now understand that good economics and good politics feed off each other. They're not, one doesn't challenge the other. And a good example would be trust in the state. Trust in the state is a very important asset in making things work. For example, people paying their taxes, complying with policies that government is devising. If the citizens buy into the idea that the state is doing things in the right way, that can facilitate all kinds of policies that would otherwise be very hard to implement. But it also means that we need to not just pay attention to the policies themselves, but also to how the policies are perceived. And there's a lot of survey evidence emerging now that we need to study almost the cognitive processes of the ways people understand the reasons why government are implementing this policy or that policy, not just saying to them that's the way it is, but actually working with the citizens to allow them to understand that. And that's a very important role of politics together with economics. You can make the changes together, provided, I think, people understand purpose and the purpose of the change that's been asked. And I think that came out very clearly in COVID, by the way. If you look at countries that coped relatively well with the COVID pandemic versus those that didn't, measured in different ways, either compliance with social distancing measures or just in terms of mortality and other things, the countries with high trust in government tended to do a lot better in COVID than the countries with low trust in government. But of course, this only works if government can deliver. And that's, as we saw earlier from the quote from Arthur Lewis, he certainly understood that you have to have government deliver to be able to deliver the kind of policy agenda. And we are facing, I think we live in a world now where even daily we see new sources of polarization and disruption in our politics. And that can spill over into our development policies and the way we're trying to manage the economy. And people are, I think there's a good deal of evidence on this, particularly among the young, are frustrated by some of what they see in politics. And there's even a creeping disaffection with democracy. Maybe we should be looking to a more Chinese-style model of more authoritarian economic management. And there's sort of two reactions, simplistic to that. One is to say we need to pass power up. Maybe it's because we're operating as too many nation states trying to do their own thing, and we need more supranational authority. That's one reaction. There needs to be more global cooperation in bodies. The other is the opposite. We need to pass more power down. There's a lot, I don't know if this is true in Saint Lucia, but there's a lot of interest in the idea of using more deliberative processes in democratic systems to try and engage the citizens more effectively in policy discussion. Even some people saying it's healthy to have more protest. We want to encourage citizens who don't believe in something to protest. And more grassroots action, more people doing things at the grassroots level. So there's a kind of passing power down view and a passing power up view. But there's a concern the nation state is kind of getting pulled in both those directions, and governments of nation states are struggling. But these are very important debates. I don't think we have simple answers, but these are important debates to be having, whether the framework we have. Because if we don't engage with this, I think there is this, as I said, creeping dissatisfaction. So if you look in the World Values Survey, which is a commonly used survey, a lot of the disaffection with democracy is among the young. And we don't know where that's going. It could be a life cycle thing. So by the time the young are middle-aged, maybe they'll have thrown off their concerns about democracy and come to love it. Or it could be that the next generation really will stay with that. And these are things we have to pay attention to. So the final thing is a capable state. Well, who could disagree with that? Of course, the devil is in the details of what we mean by a capable state. But this has been a huge research topic in economics in recent years, understanding the nature of state competence, how we can build it and how we can sustain it. And obviously in any sphere in which the state is involved, you can think of examples, whether it's running an education system or a legal system or collecting taxes. These all require state capacities, but the important thing is they don't just fall from the sky. These are things we build. And there are lovely examples from history where you see states getting involved in something, and some do it very badly, and others do it very well. And you can say, why did the ones that did it well do it better? And often it's because you built the organizational capacity, the training. So the evolution of tax systems is particularly interested in this respect. How did you build a capacity to raise very significant tax revenues? Was it about training tax inspectors? Was it about convincing citizens it was a social obligation to pay their taxes? All of these things become important. But of course, state capacity is always having to evolve because the challenges always evolve. So right now, the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, had a very interesting report about 2 years ago on the state capacity you need to deal with climate issues, and whether governments already had the kinds of institutions and frameworks in place to do that. And of course, the answer is many of the things that worked in an earlier era were not there, and so we need to build those. And people are asking the same question now about dealing with artificial intelligence, and I'm going to close with a few words on artificial intelligence, and that will be that. As I say, you can look around the world at states that have done things well and ask why did they do them well, or how did they do them well, more importantly. What investments did they make, and how did they make those investments, and what support do they need to do that. The one thing you do find, if you come back to the happiness data, is that there's a very strong correlation, and it is only a correlation, between national happiness measured in the happiness surveys and living in a capable state, however you choose to measure it. So states, at least prima facie, can contribute mightily to well-being, and that's not a surprise. So the question is how we get that. Okay, I'll end with a few words on applying the principles in practice, because I've just given you these broad principles. So how can you make them useful? The one thing I've not given you, I hope you understand, is a list of policies. I think that's pretty clear from what I said. And those are only going to come from having the kinds of discussions in the right forums to talk about specific challenges that each country faces. But I'll end by applying these ideas very quickly to the AI challenge. Every country in the world over the next 5 to 10 years is going to face the challenge of what kind of adaptation are we going to have to all of the new technologies that are emerging. And most governments that I know of are grappling with the question of what are we going to do? Are we just going to let the market decide which technologies get used and by whom and how? Or is there going to be a government regulation of that incorporation? And I think the answer is nobody quite knows yet what the playbook is going to be. And that is even true in debates about how governments will use AI. How will citizens interact with their governments? Will it be via chatbots, or will it be via politicians or bureaucrats? How will that communication be fundamentally altered? How will our communication with each other be altered? Some people think that AIs will become our friends. We won't need human friends, we'll just have AIs as friends. These could have potentially major impacts on the way we live our lives, and we think that government policies may have some bearing on that. So how would you apply our principles to AI? It won't give you I'm not promising you a simple set of policy prescriptions, but I can say when you're interrogating those issues, I think our principles apply rather well. What criteria are we going to use to say whether a particular change is brought about by AI are good or bad? One we could use is, does it make the economy grow? Is it all about the money? If people have more money, AI is great. If they have less money, AI is terrible. So is it just about money? Can we measure the benefits and costs? Well, I don't think anyone believes that's true. And one of the fundamental things that people who are working on this in social science are acutely aware of are how it's going to change or fragment communities. Are we just not going to be interacting with each other as much as we do now? And that could have profound changes on the nature of the communities and society. So that's our first principle. The second principle is, if we think that some forms of AI are valuable, and I'm sure we will, I mean, the applications in healthcare are just going to be remarkable. How do we then incentivize healthcare providers to take these new technologies, to enable them to have the training, etc.? So can we incentivize? How will we do it in the areas we do think it's important? So our principle 2 applies. Principle 3, what about the vulnerabilities? How do we create a resilient society that uses AI? What are the vulnerabilities we're creating by doing so, and how do we address them? Our principle 4, about politics and economics. How are we going to involve our citizens in debates about the way AI had changed their lives. How do we want to engage them? We don't want to scare them and tell them there are all these potentially dangerous consequences, but we need to have them understand the changes to inform the kinds of policies. And then finally, what kinds of state capabilities do we need? Do we need new state capabilities? Are existing legal frameworks capable of handling? Let me just give you one example. I went to a presentation by a lawyer who works on AI. Anyone who, I'm sure, I'd be very surprised if everyone in the room has not at least engaged with, say, ChatGPT or Claude or one of these major AIs. Maybe some not. No, I'm seeing a few people not looking like me. But one of the things you get is something called hallucination. AI will literally make things up. And some people will take decisions based on that. And the question is, are the liability laws that we have for other products fit for purpose when people are starting to make decisions, how much to invest in my pension, where do I live, what do I do, on the basis of an interaction with an AI. So it's creating lots of issues around legal liabilities that simply are unresolved, as far as I can tell. So those are examples of how the state has to evolve to understand this. Okay, so here's my final slide. Am I okay on time? Yeah. What I've tried to articulate is that maybe as part of our shaping our tomorrow, I suppose I'm on that part of the agenda now, is we need to think of what are the economic principles that will be useful to us in navigating our way through the challenges that we face. And I put forward, on the basis of our London consensus, controversial though it may be, a way of thinking perhaps about the challenges. But we need to get granular. We need to get into the specifics. It's not going to help us at some lofty level. So it's very different from, I think, what became the playbook of the Washington consensus. It means we have to ask fundamental questions. What do we care about and why? What are the things we are trying to achieve and why are we trying to achieve those? And one of the projects I have going at the LSE at the minute, we're bringing philosophers back into that conversation, not just economists, not just social scientists, but people who think about what makes life meaningful and important. Will it support growth? Do we think growth is important? If so, how will we do that? What are the vulnerabilities? How can we make things resilient in the face of those vulnerabilities? And how will the politics and the economics interact here? Will they be pulling apart or pushing together, or how can we make that work together? And is the state capable enough to respond in ways that we think are important? And the proof of this will be in how many people take these ideas and use them. We hope they will. As I say, you're all very welcome to go download any of our ideas. But I do think had Arthur Lewis been around today, I'm sure we'd have been engaging with him and wanting to get his perspective, and perhaps he'd have agreed with us, perhaps I'm sure he'd have had his own views. But we think that there's something here in honouring his legacy, as we all do, or every day for anybody who's interested in development, because he was telling us we have to keep rethinking and rethinking these ideas. They're not cast in stone, and the world is changing, but we think a set of sound economic principles will be useful in managing the challenges ahead. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Tim, for a very engaging presentation. You said you were going to be controversial. I still thought it was not very, very controversial, but my questions will be.
Good.
And this is now the part of the lecture I think most of our audience is waiting for, including members of the Kiwanis Club, which we welcome in our presence today. To ask Sir Tim Besley questions, we have mics centered in our aisles, one to my left and one to my right. But in Saint Lucia, we have an expression I can explain to you afterwards because it's in Creole. It says, Bev Duva, Berglonet. So I am going to take the privilege of asking you some of the first questions based on your presentation. So One of the questions I had, because we're speaking about economic development in a number of ways, but what about global governance shaping economic development and the role of the state, especially when it does not fit into the neoliberal paradigm that you spoke of? That's the first question I have, and then after you answer, I'll ask the second.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, there's two versions of your question, and I think I can address both. One is that of course, we don't have a kind of global body that could functionally deal with these issues globally. So we, for better or worse, we still have to deal with these issues at the level of nation states. But what we do have are international bodies that I think can potentially be very supportive. So we're, of course, in our work trying to, our first presentation of these ideas was at the World Bank, where we had a very big audience, including an audience online of people around the world. So it is trying to engage a global community and all of the players that are important in shaping global developments. I think the question of, I mean, it's a little bit related to what I said earlier. Some people think that the challenges now we face are so immense that we can only do it above the level of the nation state, somehow with global governance. I think, though, it's fair to say we live in a world where the immediate prospects for greater global cooperation do not look immensely promising. You know, of course, we have to work with people outside of our borders. It's probably more important than ever to do so. But it won't be global. I think it will be working with people we feel share our sentiments about the way to approach issues. It will be finding a coalition of people who want to work together on these issues rather than necessarily being able to do it at a fully global level at this point.
Thank you. My second question is kind of two-pronged. Earlier on, you spoke about productive jobs. What defined a job being productive, particularly since you spoke later on in your presentation about persons now measuring happiness? And I'm interested in highlighting which countries now took a look at happiness, because from Sir Arthur Lewis's own point of view in looking at developmental economics, I'm sure there could have been an unhappiness measure for the Caribbean and other states that would have led long before a happiness index was looked at in terms of the economy.
Yeah. Well, I'll say a couple of things on that. I don't want to give you the impression that I think survey questions on people's happiness is going to be a driver of everything that we do. I mean, there are people out there, some colleagues in economics, who think that they've developed a new science of happiness, and that should be a guiding principle for all economic policy. And I do know people who have a very strong view of that, but that's not my view. I think what that work drives us towards is certainly thinking about what matters to people, and the happiness can give us a clue. For example, you won't be surprised to hear having strong relationships is very correlated with personal happiness. Again, you may say that's obvious, but some people learn that from the happiness data. You know, they may say, why am I not feeling so good? Well, maybe I should improve the quality of my relationships with people in where I live. So there are things you can learn and improve your life from the work. But I think what I suspect we need to do is develop much more of a dashboard approach, an approach with different indicators, one of which would be economic success. I mean, people do value economic success. They value progression in their careers, financial progression, not just other forms of progression. So I'm not saying we should just move entirely away from that. In the area of jobs, though, I do feel that just evaluating a job on the basis of its wages and hours would be an error, and we need a richer dashboard, if you like, for thinking about what makes a job valuable. But it wouldn't just be happiness either. There would be a collection of things that make a job worthwhile and valuable. For example, how much am I respected in this job? It would be an example. So I just think we need a rebalancing and a way of thinking about a broader set of things rather than just jumping on happiness is all that matters. I don't think that's the right take home myself.
Thank you. Audience, you're welcome. I'm not greedy in asking questions at all. I see Monsignor Patrick Anthony. Please take the mic, and the other lovely young lady to my left. You can just line up behind him so you can just flow afterwards.
Yes, economics is not my forte. Walcott, that's my forte. However, I was fascinated by your Washington consensus and London consensus and the new paradigm shift we seem to be having now with the Trump consensus. I mean, just today we've been hearing a model of bringing in governments, billion-dollar governments, to create some kind of a global paradigm. How does your London consensus relate to that kind of thought?
Well, I'll say something with a degree of confidence on that, which is I don't think at the moment Trump is doing a tremendous job in creating a consensus, unless I'm not looking in the right place. He's certainly shaking up, the world order. We see that, and meaning that people are having to re-examine things that they thought they understood. So, it's certainly provocative in that sense. Of course, I don't know so much about his proposed peace board and how that would work, but at the moment, it's very hard to see that as a consensus-building project, rather than driving through a particular agenda, which is obviously the one that he believes in and his government believes in. But I don't think it's driving us towards more consensus, unless I'm misinterpreting it.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciated the emphasis on the structural transformation. And to comment on a question, Arthur Lewis's nephew, Professor Vaughan Lewis, did a similar analysis speaking to the situation of small island development states, pointing that while Lewis focused on industrialization with unlimited supplies of labor, he saw us achieving development outside of the industrialization model, more in the service area. And we would think that that held a lot of promise for us in small island developing states, given our challenges with economies of scale and industrialization. So in your comments on the importance of production, it led me thinking about Vaughan Lewis's emphasis on non-productive sectors or linked to manufacturing and industrialization, and the promise it held for small states. So my question is, in light of your London consensus, are you aware of any application to the realities of small island developing states? And if there are any opportunities for assessing the likely impact of AI on small island developing states in this new social structural transformation model.
Right. Thank you. I'll say, obviously, very, very detailed question. I won't be able to address it as well as I possibly could, but two things. One is I agree wholly with not saying that manufacturing and industrialization is necessarily the strategy. And we know one very large country example where predominantly it's been a movement into services, and that's actually India. So Indian growth has been heavily driven by services, not by manufacturing. So it's quite feasible to have sustained growth not in manufacturing. So that you're absolutely correct. That to say that there's some people. I mean, there's very things written on this that you kind of go agriculture, manufacturing to services, but it looks increasingly like countries are not necessarily doing that. Now, building services, particularly those that are export services, because there are many services that you can effectively earn. You can sell abroad. Many of the basic things are similar. You have to have good infrastructure. Maybe it's now digital infrastructure, not physical infrastructure for some services. But you still need the skills often high-end services are very skill dependent. One of the reasons why India became such a power in IT was because it had some very good training colleges, the Indian technical colleges. Now, I don't know how replicable those ideas are in small island economies, but my hunch is that there's nothing, it wasn't because of India's vastness that it somehow was able to go down that route. It was really by specializing and finding niches, Emphasis, for example, was an Indian business built in India, a global firm. I think that's a perfectly viable model, I would have thought, in small island economies, to find those niches that enable high-end services. Because, of course, if you just have call centers, for example, that's services, but it's not high-end services, not those necessarily produce highly productive jobs. But I do think it's a viable strategy, but it has all the same ingredients. You need good government, you need support, you need training, you need all those same elements. It's not different if it's manufacturing or services.
Yeah, good night, everyone. I'd like to ask a question on your own opinion on President Donald Trump's economic aggressive policy on globalization, in particular in regards to the future. Because I know this lecture is speaking on the future, economics for the future, right? As a worrying-out economist, what is your opinion on the current Donald Trump's method of his economic policy, as in aggressive tariffs? What will it do for the future?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of imponderables in the future, and I'll slightly hide behind those in answering your question. But I think one of the things the world is trying to figure out now is this a short-term phenomenon, or is this a fundamental shift in long-term policy? And I think until we understand that, we won't really understand the answer to your question. Now, clearly, he's using his economic strategy in two ways. He's using it obviously directly as an economic strategy, but he's also using it as part of a geopolitical strategy. Which of those is more sustainable in the long run, we don't say, we won't know. And of course, it's not without consequence for the US economy. It has major consequences for those who are having to pay those tariffs. But at the end of the day, US consumers will have to pay more for many goods as a consequence of the strategy. And again, how that's going to play out over what time period and in what way, we don't know yet. So I mean, we know what we're living through now. We know the rhetoric and we know some of the policy, but we're only just about a year into this. I mean, many of us will not. It's easy to believe it's longer, but the question is the long run. Now, even before Trump, though, and this is important to realize, there were various debates going on about so-called deglobalization, driven, for example, by the pandemic. Discovering that you were dependent on certain supply chains. Car manufacturing ground to a halt during the pandemic because of the supply of computer chips, because you need those in cars. So there were already debates about so-called deglobalization that were happening before that. And the question of how dependent do you want to be on this or that country. And so those debates, I think, will continue. And people are beginning to look at where their vulnerabilities are, who do they trade with, and what dependence does that create for their economy. And I think that will be, it's not just a legacy of the Trump policies, it's just the legacy of moving the dial so far in the direction of global open markets that we're learning about.
Hi, I have too many questions. I think I'll focus it around supply chains. And that interaction internationally. Now, going to the Washington Consensus, or I believe it's around that period of time. We had with all the economies interacting with each other, right? I know around that period of time, we also thought a lot about how countries loan to each other, right? Which is where, going on into the 21st century, we had the massive debt forgiveness because of the economic crises going on that, led to, all countries realizing maybe screwing each other over with heavy debt is not a good idea, right? And so going on to more economic cooperation, which now a lot of that debt is private, which then moves on to things like COVID happening, right? Our supply chains getting messed up, and as you just mentioned, how we fall, a lot of people are realizing who do they trade with, who do they work with, right? And there's a massive economic crisis globally, right, affecting every nation. And in terms of now a lot of those loaners are private instead of, governmental, so the forgiveness doesn't really happen as easily. And the way we interact, like I know the WHO was talking about the way that we interact with each other supply chain-wise, there were only a few nations capable of researching COVID at the time, right? And then we think about what if more of us could have worked together so the supply chains weren't limited by just a couple nations, right? And then we talk about deglobalization and us stopping to interact with each other, right? And part of the core issue is who we interact with, how we interact with each other. And when you go further into deglobalization, healthcare also takes a decline. And that also interacts with the structure of economics. So how, with all of this conversation being conflated into how we interact with each other, do you think in the current economic crisis is going on post-COVID, and especially with Trump's agenda that we have discussed and how it's been furthering who we work with and how we work with, do you think that deglobalization process is going to be pushed forward more or accelerated, not just debated, as it only takes one to ruin the pot of many, and the US being the world police, which we all begrudgingly hate but deal with, now messing with most of the world's agenda, how does that interact with our deglobalization being more imminent and not just a matter of debate?
But I get a lot of questions.
Yeah, I know.
Let me just make. I'll just make. Forgive me for just making a small number of points in response. I think the thing that you said that I resonated most with me is that, using the term global economic crisis, that's one way to put it. But I think what a lot of countries were doing, as I was saying earlier, even before last year, was realizing that the economic model that we were using, the one that was not created by the Washington Consensus, but certainly was supported, did create vulnerabilities that we have to address. Vulnerabilities among our populations, across nations, and we got reminders. So I think it would be strong to say COVID was created by that, but COVID had to cope with that. Yeah. The global financial crisis was another example. And when those things are going on and we're living in a world where we're being reminded of those vulnerabilities, we need to create solutions to those. And I think that's where the principles I was talking about tonight could be useful in responding to those things. Now, I'll make one more small point, which is when we were in Washington, D.C. to present these ideas at the World Bank, there is a lot of work going on at the minute, which are concerns about indebtedness and the consequences of indebtedness in many countries. Actually, developed and developing countries are all experiencing this. And one thing is, well, last time all this became a huge issue, the Washington Consensus was the standard playbook in responding to that. Now, one possibility is that it's going to be that this time, if things evolve, that will be true. But most people say, no, we need different ways of thinking about that. And the Economic Prospects Group at the World Bank that does work on this are doing some really interesting work on looking at different strategies that might have to be used to cope with what could be otherwise nasty fallout on indebtedness. But of course, that hasn't quite crystallized yet, but it's something that may happen.
Thank you. Good evening. just want to look at a little bit of the Washington and the London consensus, and perhaps look how we form a Saint Lucian consensus.
Yes,
and looking at how we sustain double-digit growth in terms of small island economies like ours, in terms of our future and our success. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, the truth is, the last thing you probably need is some semi-informed person coming from London to tell you how to run your economy. So I'm not going to fall into that trap. But the truth of the matter is, I would, and you obviously have a lot of ideas already that you want to bring. But if Saint Lucia was interested in working with many of the talented people we have in our network on looking at the principles, how they work, I'm absolutely sure they would they would be jumping on planes or at least on Zoom calls to begin with to talk to people here if there is, as you're formulating your economic plans and strategies. But I doubt, and this is from bitter experience that you've all had, there's some simple silver bullet that's sitting in my back pocket that I can pull out and say, if only you did this, then the world would be better. But I do feel that having a set of core guiding principles for any economy around which you can build a consensus is absolutely central. And maybe you already have them. I'm not saying you don't, but I do think that some of the ideas, I hope, would be least useful in moving towards that.
Good evening. I just wanted to say thank you for doing such a good job with your presentation. I'm currently an economics student at the University of the West Indies, and it's come up a lot in conversations, both casual and formal, of AI and its development and what that means for the Caribbean region. So during your presentation, I took the time to just type out a question so that I don't end up rambling on the mic. While these developments are often framed as opportunities for growth, Sir Arthur Lewis's model reminds us of the importance of structural transformation and sustainable productivity-enhancing development rather than short-term or externally driven gains. In that context, how should Caribbean governments assess proposals from foreign investors seeking land and incentives to develop AI or other technology infrastructure, and what economic, environmental, or governance warnings do you believe policymakers should heed to avoid repeating extractive development patterns in the region?
Right. That's a very good question, indeed. Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll say, the answer is I don't have something I can just, it's in my pocket, here it is. But let me make one comment, because you said one thing I think that's very important for us to realize, is that we cannot be outsourcing our futures to global tech companies. They are producing lots of new and important ideas, but the way they're deployed and how they're deployed will be dependent on the decisions we make. Now, I think of one example would be which is controversial. I don't know what the position on this here is. The Australian ban on using social media for kids under the age of 16, which has, it's a very stark form of regulation of a technology. Other countries are now looking at that and saying maybe we should do that too. But it reminds us that in relation to tech, there will be many new technologies, and there are many new technologies being developed as at a rapid pace. It will be the choices of countries how they see those deployed and the safeguards, if any, they want to put in place. And we really cannot say, well, whatever happens in Silicon Valley is, whatever they do is good enough for us, and we'll just sort of import all technologies without thinking about their consequences. I don't know if any of you have read Jonathan Haidt's book called The Anxious Generation, which is a kind of social commentary on social media and the consequences for the generation that have been brought up with social media. The remarkable thing about his story, it's a somewhat controversial story, but it's taken very seriously, is how this was all done with almost no government intervention of any kind, of things now that we understand have very material, not material, but psychological consequences for a generation of children. We can't keep on doing that, just saying blindly we're going to do this. So I'll only endorse the need for what you're saying you need, which is a clearly defined country-specific strategy that recognizes the context that's relevant to that, not just saying we must. So one thing I hear from some politicians is, oh, we'll fall behind if we don't take every new idea and deploy it in our economy. I think that's a dangerous idea. Falling behind is, could mean lots of things, but just because an idea or technology exists, that if we don't go hell for leather and get it incorporated as quickly, I do think there's a case for being more reflective than we have been in the past.
Good evening. So my impression is that the reason why the Washington consensus, and for most of history, we focused on measuring well-being using something like GDP, and that's probably because of its measurability. Now, if we begin talking about happiness, etc., then we have a serious measurement problem. And so I want you to comment on how practical it is to implement your principles. And this is what I have in mind. How are we going to, if for example, we have governments that are going to be sensitive to what makes people happy, what is the process via which that information gets to them? How do they know? Because it seems to me that part of the practical problem is politicians have to demonstrate that they've delivered. A government can cite growth numbers, the rate of growth of GDP, and people understand that. And governments or political parties always want to be re-elected. So how does a government, or how will a government be incentivized to focus on things that are not particularly measurable? You can't go on a platform and say, we did this or we did that, and here's the evidence. And I have another question/comment, but I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, the evidence that rising GDP gets you re-elected is actually very weak. I mean, this has been a much studied question. But my colleagues, and I want to stress, I'm not saying we should just reduce it to happiness. I'm definitely not saying that. But people who've studied that have argued that actually increases in national happiness are a much better prediction of electoral victories than our GDP growth. So I don't know, I wouldn't claim expertise on that evidence, but that claim has certainly been made. But the point is, I want to start where you started, that GDP was never created to be a measure of well-being. If you look at all the advances in national income accounting, well, not all of them, but a very significant number of them happened during the Second World War. Why? Because governments needed to know how many armaments to produce. So they created a system for measuring output so that they could run a war economy. It wasn't created because they said, oh, we've got this great new way of measuring how well off people are. It was a very practical measure of wanting to manage the economy. And it was only much later that it became part of something where you boasted about the amount of growth you were producing. And so there was a kind of slippage between something that tells you, how many cars are you producing and how many, tons of agricultural crops or whatever. You need to know that as a government, not least because you need to know how many taxes you're likely to raise. So GDP has a role, but the slippage from saying GDP has a role in economic management to GDP is the thing we care about. Where that happened, I don't know, someone will have written about that, but it was never intended to be something. And I think there are people who think that national happiness, and actually governments are measuring national happiness. We actually do publish in the UK national happiness statistics. Nobody thinks they're going to give us the answer to how to run economic policy. But we need broader measures. I think there are just much broader measures. For example, equality type measures. People say, what kinds of inequalities you have should be part of economic management policy. There are many things we care about in societies that are not picked up through GDP, and therefore we just need a broader approach, not one measure that we rely on.
So, can I go?
Yes, you can do your second question, and after yourself, we have two ladies at the back who have our final questions for the evening.
So I will try to be very brief on this. It seems to me that if you go back to the 2007-2008 financial crisis, we had a period of deregulation and weak enforcement of a lot of regulation, particularly financial regulation, at the same time increase in deficits. It seems to me that movie is being replayed. So I just wanted your opinion on what you think the likelihood is of another financial crisis, let's say in the next 3 to 4 years.
Well, I'm not sure I'd even trust my own judgment on the last thing. The thing I will say, I don't know if you're familiar, there's a book by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt called This Time It's Different. And they write about the sort of financial and fiscal crises of the past. And in the run-up to any crisis, people will make a claim that the world is different in this way or that way, and no two crises are actually alike. It's true to say they may have some common features that, for example, they're challenging for governments to deal with, but I don't. So you're right. The world has and hasn't changed, but in some types of financial regulation, particularly with the new Basel rules for regulating banks, it's changed dramatically since the financial crisis. But that doesn't mean that somewhere else in the system there can't be things that are causing vulnerabilities in the economy. But where they will manifest themselves, I couldn't necessarily predict.
Good night, everyone. I'm going to be brief given the situation. I note with thought-provoking presentation. Thank you. I think you were able to do that without being controversial, which is a feat in itself. Yeah. My question stems around migration, immigration in particular. I noticed you hadn't touched on it. Yeah. And how do you see migration solving the labor problem, the skill shortage, and ultimately economic policies, the success of an economic policy is measured at the most basic level as to how it generates growth. And to generate growth, you need people. You need people to move where resources are, where work is. The current climate of immigration policies, many have argued, is not only hostile, but very debilitating in terms of providing global growth. Just recently, Prime Minister Mia Mottley said that we are very good at moving goods around the world, but we have a problem moving labor and persons. What are your views on that?
Yeah, well, you're completely right that these are important issues. But let me also add one thing to this that's really now driving that debate is also fertility decline in a number of countries. So those countries that are experiencing that are now having to ask themselves where they're going to get labor in future. I will put my hand up on one thing, and someone pointed out early on when we presented our book, we actually don't have a chapter on labor migration in our book, and we wondered why we didn't do it. I don't think the issue is quite so.
I was curious.
So in the next edition of the book, we will certainly be adding a chapter on labor migration and immigration. But you're absolutely right that these are now incredibly pressing issues, and we don't really cover them. Maybe it would have led to a sixth principle, I can't say, without us having explored it.
I think Angela Merkel sort of set the precedent when she took in, during the Arab Spring, she demonstrated that with proper immigration policy, you can generate economic growth without depleting resources elsewhere. So maybe a good place to start.
Okay. As our next person posing a question comes forth, interestingly, we said, we're talking about consensus. Can come forth while I'm speaking, consensus, and I realized that the men of Saint Lucia, as the Archdiocese of Castries has declared this year the Year of Men, have decided to challenge the question consensus, but without inclusion, we can't really build consensus. So we will allow the two gentlemen who deliberately broke the consensus on the question to ask very brief, emphasis on brief questions after the young lady.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And building on the previous question, thinking about lack of capacity and people, Saint Lucia and the rest of the Caribbean has quite a large diaspora. So I wonder what your thoughts are, and that maybe that could constitute your sixth principle. What is your opinion on diaspora and capacity building? And I think it kind of matches with your second principle of growth.
Yeah, as I said to the previous questioner, it's not something we tackled in what we've done, but I think it is a gap in what we're thinking. And you know, as you say, many countries are having to rethink their strategies now on these things. But one thing we know is that in terms of building human capital, migration is hugely important. But we're also learning that not every country can be a country that imports labor, and that can have profound consequences for the countries where people leave too. But it's not something on which I have a simple, punchy answer, I'm afraid, to give you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Besley, for your generosity of being here. In fact, somebody whispered in my ears that you came here freely of your own doing and didn't cost the state a cent. So I think we want to give you a round of applause for your generosity. One of the things you mentioned, which stuck with me, was that when you have a zero-sum game situation, it leads to problems for politicians. And at a global level right now, it feels to me as if we're in this era where a lot of politicians seem to believe that they're in this zero-sum game for their countries, and it's leading to what appears to be very clear aggression. We're seeing land grabs, we're seeing grabs for resources. Even right now, of course, we're seeing increased militarization, the uptick of defense spending at the expense of development finance. Are you, one, fearful that we could be potentially entering a new era of colonialization again, or neocolonialization? And how is that going to, in your view, impact developing countries and developing economics? Thank you.
Well, that's a huge, again, you're asking me huge questions that I require. Let me talk about the zero-something. I think one of the fundamental lessons when you study economics is zero-sum thinking is mostly incorrect. I mean, there are some situations if there's a fixed resource and somebody gets it and the other doesn't. But mostly, economics is about gains from cooperation and trade. And so zero-sum thinking is often just mistaken thinking in economic terms, that most of the things we do, if we work together, we can do more than we could do individually. Now, of course, the distribution of those gains, who gets the most out of that, is a point of contestation. But I think it's a dangerous world in which we start to think of the world as entirely a set of purely zero-sum transactions. And so I would strongly say that one of the virtues of studying economics is you shouldn't think that way if you at least studied it well. But as to your question about a new era of colonialization, that's a big question, and I'm not sure I have an answer for.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I think the very fact that you and your colleagues have come together and had this, begin to put what we are calling now the London consensus, is probably reflective of a sense that there is tension in the global economy and society about whether the appropriateness of the current systems that we have that flowed out of the Washington consensus. And as you alluded earlier on, context matter. So I'm wondering to what extent you and your colleagues have incorporated sort of that whole the principle of context to take into account, especially the peculiarities or challenges of small states in some of the metrics that have been used, because we have been disadvantaged by a lot of sort of one-size-fits-all kind of thinking, where something has worked somewhere and they feel it should be transferred to us, and this is what is a prescription to us. We have seen it with the Asian tigers, of liberalization, and so on, and we have seen how that has played out. So I'm asking really, for example, we are disqualified from participating in access to concessionary loans, for example, because of some notion of either per capita income, our income is too high, or we are graduating from something, because our context is not taken into account in terms of our geography, or the threats that we face from, for example, disaster, the diseconomies of size, and all of those things. So I'm saying at this point of inflection, as it is, based on what you're saying, a reset moment, we need to incorporate in the sort of new approaches that you're advocating, the need for context and a greater use for things like I call indices that take in with different weights that take into account context. So I just want to see that if we have that principle sort of given greater attention, if you want to comment on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you read our book, you'd see that we're very much in tune with that idea. That what we think is where the principles are powerful is when they can be combined with local context to provide solutions. That's exactly what we're advocating. So I agree wholly with you that it's about making sure that we don't have prescriptions that are not contextually grounded. So I can only agree with what you're saying, and that's very much a part of what we're doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Saint Besley. For certainly a wonderful presentation and engagement with our audience. And at this time, it is always fitting to say thank you. Nous voulons dire merci. We want to tell you thank you from our college to you. And to assist us in that token presentation, we wish to welcome our Vice Principal of Academics, Dr. Winston Fulgence. We will be presenting tokens of appreciation to Sir Tim Besley, his wife, Lady Gillian Besley, Resident British Commissioner of Saint Lucia, Amy Quantrill. Please come forward. Yes. We must always say thank you to the individuals who have made together. So, lovely outline of the map of Saint Lucia, so you'll never forget.
I will be.
Yes. Nobel Laureate Festival presented to Sir Tim Besley for serving as keynote speaker at the 2026 Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture, 22nd of January 2026. My only inclusion would have been in Creole if I had my chance. Yes. Thank you from us to you.
Thank you.
Yes. We also have some locally made items to be presented to Lady Besley. And of course, the engine behind a number of the things that we see here today, our resident British Commissioner, Amy Quantrill. Yes, so at Sir Arthur Lewis, we have many hidden treasures, one of them meaning the Le Fort restaurants, which you are welcome to dine with us. So we look forward to seeing you there.
I'm already a fan, thank you.
You're already a fan, wonderful. A round of applause once again. And we also have a special token presentation to a young man who has ensured that he's been present at these key presentations. Caden, can you come up, please? Wow, laureate in the making. And we want to encourage exposure for our young people.
So, Caden, Mommy, you should probably be here too. Caden's birthday is tomorrow. He's more than a laureate in the making. His birthday is on January 23rd, ladies and gentlemen. And his mom has ensured that from what age? From 2. He comes to the lectures with her.
Excellent.
So I hope he's been absorbing all that he's been hearing. So Caden, happy birthday in advance. And he can sing the whole song, You Can Be Next.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You may have your seats. Now, you said that his birthday is tomorrow. My mother's birthday is actually tomorrow, so I'm a daughter of a laureate, proudly accepting that. I know my mother is watching. Mom, I love you. Happy birthday in advance from this platform. And to help us thank all the wonderful persons who made tonight possible, I want to welcome Ms. Charlize Moyes, economics student at the St. Louis Community College. Put your hands together.
Good evening. On behalf of Sir Alpha Lewis Community College and the organizing committees, thank you to everyone who made this evening, Sir Alpha Lewis Memorial Lecture, a success. We extend our sincere appreciation to Sir Tim Besley for a lecture that was clear, thoughtful, and relevant, reminding us that economics is not just a theory, but a tool for understanding and improving the world around us. Thank you to the National Nobel Laureate Festival Committee and the Sir Alpha Lewis Community College Nobel Laureate Committee for their leadership and continued commitment to honoring our Nobel legacy. We acknowledge Ms. Amy Quantrill for coordinating our guest speakers' visit and our main sponsor, Bank of Saint Lucia, and SLTA for their continued support of education and national development. Thank you to Mr. Ethan Glasgow for the opening prayer, Mr. Cletus Springer, and for the welcome remarks, and Dr. Winston Fulgens for assisting with the tokens of appreciation. We appreciate Mr. Raisa Joseph for serving as Mistress of Ceremony and for her elegant use of Creole, which brought warmth and distinctly St. Lucia touch to the program. Special thanks to Ms. Serena Tousse, Mrs. Elra Erme Glasgow, and steel pan performers, Ms. Jada Marie Volson and Rhea Gordon for setting the tone through music. Our gratitude also goes to the Office of Internationalization, Advancement and Partnership, the Marketing and Communications Department, the Operations Department, our security officers for keeping us safe, and for making sure no one escaped before the lecture ended, as well as Le Fort Restaurant, NTN, and GIS, our technicians, decorators, volunteers, the Student Council, the Kiwanis Club, and all economic lecturers and students who supported this event. Thank you all for joining us as we honor the legacy of Sir Alpha Lewis and continue to inspire learning at Sir Alpha Lewis Community College. Thank you.
And thank you, Charlize, for a job well done. Round of applause for her again. What is left for me to say is to thank our audience in studio with us today and those who are watching virtually at home. It was a pleasure, and without an audience, there isn't really any purpose of a discussion. And our job is to share the content. We have an open source of information that Sir Tim proudly shared with us, and we have to share with others. To close this evening, we want to welcome our songbird, Mrs. Elra Erme Glasgow, who will guide us in the college anthem, which I encourage all of you to sing together, which speaks to the motto of excellence at the Sir Alpha Lewis Community College. And thereafter, we invite you for excellent refreshments before we meet the Somme consensus. So,
please stand. Aim high, my fellow men, you of SALCC. Let's build a name that will always last and always honored be. Let's make a pledge to ever keep in sacred reverence our motto, constant and upright pursuit of excellence. March on, my fellow men, let nothing you detain. Follow the path our graduates trod, from tardiness refrain. Turn not from diligence and truth, gain knowledge, eloquence. Remember that our motto is pursuit of excellence. Sing out, my fellow men, with sweetness fill the air. SALCC of Montfortune, let all our hearts revere. Be education of the best, your armor and defense. Our motto, constant and upright, pursuit of excellence.